You are about to experience the film Titanic, but in the form of a book. Because a book is perceived in a completely different way. Enjoy listening. Chapter 1. The Descent. In the black silence of the deep Atlantic, two pale lights appeared, faint at first, then brightening, growing larger as they drifted downward like falling stars. They belonged to a pair of submersibles, ghostly and mechanical, descending through the endless dark. Their beams cut through the blackness like swords of white fire, illuminating nothing but the drifting snow of the ocean's decay. Inside one of them, a cramped metal sphere no wider than a closet, the Russian pilot, Anatoly Mikhailovich, hummed quietly to himself, his gloved hands steady on the controls. Beside him sat Brock Lovett, a man in his late 40s, sunburned, silver-haired, and wearing the careless confidence of someone used to chasing lost fortune. A gold chain glittered against his chest, and though he slept now, slumped against the CO2 scrubber, he looked more like a pirate at rest than a scientist at work. Across from him, half asleep and snoring softly, was Louis Bodine, the ROV pilot, a broad man with an unkempt beard and the easy arrogance of someone who thought he'd already seen everything. When the submersible hit the ocean floor with a dull metallic bonk, Lovett and Bodine jolted awake. "We are here," Anatoly said in his thick accent. Outside, the seabed stretched out like a desert of pale silt. No sound, no movement, just the steady pulse of the sonar and the quiet hum of the engines. The other sub, Mir 2, appeared nearby, gliding like a ghost through the dark, its lights flickering across the seafloor. "Come left a little," Bodine muttered, staring at the sonar screen. "She's right in front of us. 15 meters, 13, there, you should see it." Anatoly squinted into the gloom. "Do you see it? I don't see—" "Wait." Out of the darkness, a shape emerged, vast, silent, impossible. The bow of a ship, its iron prow rising from the mud like the edge of a mountain. For a moment, it seemed to move, to slice through the water once more. Then the truth settled in. It was dead still. The Titanic. Her rails were draped with rusticles, long, frozen tiers of metal, and the weight of 84 years lay heavy on her like a shroud. Lovett pressed his face to the viewport. Even after 9 dives, the sight struck him with awe. "It still gets me every time," he murmured, lifting his camera and turning it toward himself. The sad ruin of the great ship, sitting here where she landed at 2:30 in the morning, April 15th, 1912, after her long fall from the world above. "Is just your guilt for stealing from the dead," Anatoly replied dryly. "Thanks, Tolya. Work with me here." The subs glided forward over the endless deck. Chains were still laid coiled where they had been left. The great anchors gleamed faintly in the floodlights. In the distance, Mir 2 drifted past the crumbling superstructure, its lights exploring the sunken palace. 3 tons per square inch, Lovett narrated softly for his camera. "These windows are 9 inches thick. If they go, it's sayonara in 2 microseconds." Soon they set the ROV, a small orange robot named Snoop Dogg, loose into the wreck. Through its twin cameras, the lost world of the Titanic unfolded again. A chandelier swaying gently in the current. A grand piano toppled on its side. A child's porcelain doll resting where someone's hand must have once left it. The ship's corridors stretched ahead like the halls of a dream. In one of the grand suites, the ROV found a wardrobe half buried under a fallen beam. Slowly, the robot's metal arm pulled it aside. Beneath it was a steel safe, small and sealed. Lovett's eyes widened. "It's payday, boys." Hours later, the safe broke open on the deck of the research ship Keldysh. water gushing out. Crew members crowded around, their breath held in. Inside, nothing. Just sludge and fragments of paper. Lovett's grin vanished. "Shit," he muttered. But among the soaked remains, the team recovered a single drawing, delicate pencil lines, forming the image of a young woman reclining on a divan, a diamond at her throat, her eyes luminous even through the stains of time. At the bottom, in fading letters, April 14th, 1912, J.D. Lovett stared at it, speechless. Then, quietly, "I'll be goddamned." He held up a photograph beside it, the heart of the ocean, a necklace of impossible beauty. It was the same jewel, the same moment, captured forever in graphite and salt. And somewhere, far from the cold steel deck of the Keldysh, an old woman sat in her California home, shaping clay with trembling hands. When she saw the image of that drawing on the television, the girl with the diamond, her breath caught. "I'll be goddamned," she whispered.
Chapter 2. The Invitation. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, a gray mirror under a low sun. On the deck of the Keldysh, the researchers moved like shadows among cables, cameras, and salt-stained machinery. The safe was empty, yet the air buzzed with the tension of discovery and disappointment. Brock Lovett leaned over the tray of water, where a fragile drawing floated like a ghost. The woman on the paper stared back at him, young, nude, unashamed, her throat adorned by a heart-shaped diamond. She was more alive on that page than any of them in the room. He turned to his crew. "It's her," he said quietly. "The heart of the ocean." No one answered. Only the slow ripple of water disturbed the silence. Later that day, the discovery made the news. On television screens across the world, Lovett's confident smile gleamed from the deck of his ship, framed by the vast Atlantic. Titanic is not just a shipwreck, it's the shipwreck, the Mount Everest of them all. Millions watched. Among them, in a small house in Ojai, California, an elderly woman sat in her ceramic studio, surrounded by clay and sunlight. Her walls were filled with paintings and tiny sculptures, relics of a life well lived. Her hands, spotted with age, moved steadily over the wheel, shaping a pot with patient grace. Her name was Rose Calvert. When she heard the words Titanic and the heart of the ocean, she froze. Her fingers stilled on the wet clay. From the living room, her granddaughter Lizzie called, "Grandma, they're talking about that ship again." Rose rose slowly from her stool, wiping her hands on a towel. The small Pomeranian at her feet followed her into the living room. On the television, the image changed. The drawing of the young woman appeared, her eyes calm, her necklace glimmering faintly even through the film of age. Rose stared at the screen, her breath caught. "Oh, I'll be goddamned." That night, the phone rang on the Keldysh. Brock Lovett almost didn't answer. He was in the middle of another argument with the investors, his voice hoarse with frustration. But Bobby Buell, his assistant, pressed the receiver into his hand. "You'll want to take this one. Trust me." Lovett sighed. "This is Brock Lovett." A voice, soft but steady, came through the line. "Mr. Lovett, I was wondering if you found the heart of the ocean yet." He froze. For a moment, all he could hear was the faint hiss of static. "Who is this?" he asked carefully. "My name is Rose Calvert. The woman in the picture is me." Lovett stared at the phone, his expression shifting from disbelief to fascination. He covered the receiver with his hand, glancing at Buell, who just grinned. "I told you, you'd want to take the call." 2 days later, a helicopter roared over the open Atlantic, its blades cutting the sky to ribbons. The Keldysh waited below, a small white speck in the vastness. Inside the chopper, Rose sat by the window, her face calm, eyes thoughtful as she gazed down at the water that once nearly claimed her life. Her granddaughter Lizzie sat beside her, clutching a small dog and a bowl of goldfish. The roar of the engines could not drown out the rush of memory rising inside her. On deck, Lovett waited with his crew, watching as the helicopter descended in a storm of spray and wind. The door opened, and for a moment the sight seemed absurd. A frail woman in a wheelchair, wrapped in a patterned shawl, surrounded by luggage, pets, and memories. But when Rose lifted her gaze, there was something regal in her composure. Bodine muttered under his breath, "She's 100 if she's a day." Lovett silenced him with a look. "And she knows about the diamond, so show some respect." Rose was gently lowered to the deck. The wind tugged at her white hair. Lizzie pushed her forward, smiling politely despite the stares. The crew gathered, half curious, half skeptical, as though some ghost had risen from the sea itself. In her small cabin aboard the Keldysh, Rose arranged her framed photographs beside the bed, her children, her grandchildren, her late husband. She even set her fishbowl carefully beside them. These, she seemed to say without words, were her treasures now. Lovett stood awkwardly by the door. "Is your stateroom all right?" he asked. "Yes, very nice." Then she turned to the dog in her lap. "And you, Freddie? Comfortable?" The room filled with quiet amusement. Then Rose looked up at Lovett. "I should like to see my drawing." In the preservation lab, under soft light, the drawing floated in a shallow tray of water. Rose leaned over it, gazing at her younger self, that girl she once was, poised and bare, the diamond glimmering at her throat. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the surface, the two faces, young and old, almost touching. Lovett watched her carefully. Louis XVI once owned a blue diamond. They say it was cut into a heart after the Revolution, the heart of the ocean. Today it would be worth more than the Hope diamond. Rose smiled faintly. "It was dreadful and heavy. I only wore it that once." Lizzie looked from her grandmother to the drawing, uncertain. "You really believe that's you?" Rose turned to her, her eyes bright with mischief. "It is me, dear. Wasn't I a hot number?" Lovett chuckled. "The necklace was bought by Caledon Hockley for his fiancée. That would be you, I suppose." Rose nodded slowly. "Yes, that would be me." Later, as the ship's lights flickered softly against the waves, Lovett led her into a small room filled with screens, live feeds from the submersibles showing the wreck below. The ghostly corridors drifted across the monitors like half-remembered dreams. Rusted railings, broken chandeliers, empty rooms still waiting for music that would never return. Rose stared at the images, her eyes reflecting the pale light. "Are you ready to go back to Titanic?" Lovett asked. She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze stayed fixed on one of the screens, the bow railing, still standing proud against the dark. "It's been 84 years, she said, at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I can still smell the fresh paint. The china had never been used. The sheets had never been slept in." Lovett reached over and turned on a recorder. The soft click seemed to echo in the silence. Titanic was called the Ship of Dreams, and it really was. Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of memory. The deep-sea images faded in Lovett's mind, and before anyone could speak again, her words carried them all away, back to 1912, to the world above the sea, to the beginning.
Chapter 3. Southampton, April 10th, 1912. The air smelled of coal smoke and sea salt, and a low mist rolled off the River Test as the morning tide pulled against the pilings. Southampton buzzed with life that day, the sounds of hooves, steam, and laughter rising in a mingled hymn to progress. The great ship waited at her berth, a white mountain of steel and ambition, her 4 towering funnels painted gold and black against the pale English sky. The Titanic. People flooded the pier like ants on a sugar loaf, dock workers shouting, vendors hawking papers, families embracing in hurried farewells. At the center of it all, a white Renault touring car creaked to a stop. The livered driver jumped down to open the door for a young woman dressed in white and lavender, a wide feathered hat shading her face. She was 17, radiant and distant, her every movement trained in the art of restraint. Her name was Rose DeWitt Bukater, and she was about to board a ship she did not want to sail. She looked up at the massive hull, her eyes cool, her voice level. "I don't see what all the fuss is about. It doesn't look any bigger than the Mauretania." A tall man beside her, elegant, polished, the kind of man who had never known hunger, gave a small, indulgent laugh. Caledon adjusted his gloves and said, "You can be blasé about some things, Rose, but not about Titanic. She's 100 feet longer than Mauretania, and far more luxurious. There's a Parisian café, Turkish baths, even squash courts." Behind them descended Rose's mother, Ruth DeWitt Bukater, a woman of fine breeding and iron will, her posture stiff as the stays in her corset. Cal offered her hand gallantly. "Your daughter is far too hard to impress, Ruth." Ruth's eyes traced the ship's gleaming lines. "So this is the vessel they say is unsinkable." Cal smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth sharp. "It is unsinkable. God himself couldn't sink this ship." The porters swarmed around them, struggling to manage the luggage, steamer trunks, hat boxes, crates, and one heavy steel safe. Cal's valet, Lovejoy, oversaw everything with the severity of a drill sergeant. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd served his master too long to question him. Cal handed a 5-pound note to a flustered porter. He said, "I put my faith in you, good sir." Money had always opened doors for him, even gangways. "Mind your step," he told Rose as they crossed a puddle. The scent of the sea mingled with the coal smoke, sharp and bitter. Rose glanced upward again at the hull. Her reflection shivered across the black steel. To everyone else, the ship was a dream made real. To her, it felt like a cage. As Cal guided her up the first-class gangway, his hand closed possessively over her arm. Rose's face softened into a perfect mask, her composure hiding the quiet scream rising inside her. It was the ship of dreams, the old Rose would later say. But to me, it was a slave ship, taking me back to America in chains. The ship's triple whistles bellowed across the harbor, 3 long notes that made the air tremble. Dock workers shouted and waved. White Star pennants snapped in the wind. The Titanic was alive, shuddering under the pulse of her engines, ready to move. In a smoky pub not far from the docks, a poker game was in progress. The tables were scarred with years of spilled ale, and laughter echoed beneath the shouts of sailors and laborers. At one table sat 2 young men,
Jack Dawson and Fabrizio de Rossi, opposite a pair of loud, red-faced Swedes. The pile of coins and crumpled bills between them was small, but the stakes were enormous. On top of the money lay 2 third-class tickets for R.M.S. Titanic. Jack held his cards close, his hair sun-bleached, his eyes bright with a restless confidence. He was an artist, a wanderer, a boy who had made the world his home and hunger his companion. Beside him, Fabrizio whispered nervously in Italian, crossing himself. The Swedes argued in their own tongue. One furious hissed, "You bet our tickets, idiot!" "Quiet," the other growled. "I'll win them back." Jack grinned. "Hit me again, Sven." The final card slid across the table. A pause, the kind of silence that pulls the air out of the room. Then Jack laid his hand down. A full house. Fabrizio shouted, leaping to his feet, "We're going to America!" The Swedes roared in protest, one punching the other as Jack scooped up the tickets, laughing. "Sorry, boys, 3 of a kind and a pair. We're riding in style now, on the Titanic." They didn't wait for the fight to finish. Jack grabbed his coat, his sketchbook, and the few coins he had left. "Come on, Fabri, we've got a date with destiny." The pubkeeper called after them. "She sails in 5 minutes." Jack grinned over his shoulder. "Then we better run." They sprinted through the crowds, dodging horses and luggage carts, their hearts hammering as the ship's whistle sounded again. The gangway was already lifting when they reached it. "Wait!" Jack yelled. "We're passengers!" A young officer at the top, 6th Officer Moody, frowned. "Have you been through the inspection queue?" "Of course we have," Jack lied cheerfully. "We're Americans, no lice, both of us." Moody hesitated, then sighed. "Right, come aboard." The gangway slammed back into place, and Jack pulled Fabrizio up after him, laughing breathlessly as they set foot on the deck. The steel walls rose around them like the gates of paradise. "We are the luckiest sons of bitches in the world!" Jack shouted. From the aft rail they looked down at the pier where the crowd cheered and waved. Jack waved back, laughing, though he knew no one there. "Goodbye, I'll miss you all." Fabrizio joined in, shouting, "Goodbye, England, I will never forget you." The great ship shuddered, tugged free by 7 tugboats. Ropes splashed into the harbor, the propellers turned, and slowly the Titanic began to move. The distance widened, the cheers faded, and Southampton slipped away beneath a haze of smoke and sunlight. At the bow, gulls wheeled over the water. The river opened into the sea, and the ship of dreams set out upon its maiden voyage.
Chapter 4. The Ship of Dreams. By the time Titanic reached the open sea, the sun had begun to sink behind the coast of Ireland, staining the water with gold. Smoke trailed from her 4 great funnels, and her engines rumbled deep in her body like the steady heartbeat of a living thing. She was the largest moving object ever built by human hands, a floating city, humming with light and laughter and the promise of eternity. On the bridge, Captain Edward John Smith stood with his gloved hands on the rail, his white beard glowing in the afternoon sun. Beside him, First Officer Murdoch watched the horizon. 21 knots, sir," Murdoch said. Smith nodded with quiet pride. "She's got a bone in her teeth now, Mr. Murdoch." Far below in the boiler rooms, a dozen stokers fed the roaring furnaces. They worked half naked in the furnace glow, shoveling coal into open mouths of fire. Sweat gleamed on their backs as they chanted to the rhythm of the ship's pulse, the ceaseless thundering of her engines driving her westward, toward America and history. Through the maze of steel corridors and echoing decks, the ship's life unfolded.
In first class, gentlemen in evening coats strolled past the smoking room, cigars glowing like stars. Ladies in silk and feathers glided through the palm court, their laughter mingling with the soft waltz of the string quartet. The air smelled of champagne and fresh varnish, and every polished surface reflected the certainty of privilege. In steerage, life was humbler, but no less alive. Irish families gathered near the long wooden tables, passing mugs of beer, fiddlers tuning their instruments. The corridors were cramped, the air thick with tobacco and voices in a dozen languages: Italian, Swedish, Polish, Gaelic. Yet there was joy there, the wild, untamed hope of people who had gambled everything on a dream. High above the bustle, Rose leaned on the railing of the first-class promenade, the Atlantic wind tugging gently at her hat. The sea stretched out before her, endless and merciless. Behind her, the sound of music floated faintly through the glass doors, laughter, crystal, and the polite murmur of the rich. But Rose heard none of it. Her thoughts were far away, somewhere she could breathe. Cow's voice intruded like the click of a lock. "I've reserved us seats for dinner tonight. Don't be late, darling." She turned. He was immaculate, as always, the perfect gentleman, the perfect jailer. "Yes, of course," she said softly. He smiled and walked away, satisfied. When he was gone, Rose's hand tightened on the rail until her knuckles whitened. From this height, the water below looked almost soft, a field of silk. She leaned forward slightly, and for one dangerous, liberating moment imagined the fall, cold, swift, final. The thought made her tremble, not from fear, but from longing. Down on the poop deck, far below the polished world of Caledon Hockley, Jack Dawson sat sketching. His back rested against a coil of rope, and his sketchbook balanced on his knees. His hands moved quickly, confident strokes bringing to life the small details of the world around him. A young girl watching the sea from her father's lap, a cluster of seagulls suspended in motion, a crewman's weathered face softened by the light. He had the look of someone born between worlds, too poor to belong to one, too free to belong to another. He drew as if it were breathing, as if without it he would simply disappear. Beside him, Fabrizio leaned on the rail, squinting toward the horizon. "Jack, you think we ever see America? The statue, maybe?" Jack smiled faintly. "I can see her already." "Where?" He pointed toward the sunset. "Right there. Very small, of course." They both laughed, their voices lost in the sound of the engines. Nearby, a young Irishman named Tommy Ryan watched with a scowl as a steward paraded 3 tiny dogs along the deck. "That's typical. First-class dogs come down here to take a shit." Jack chuckled. "That's so we know our place in the grand scheme of things." Tommy grinned, but his eyes held the same resentment as many down there, a quiet, burning knowledge of how the world was divided. And then he saw her. High above, on the B-deck promenade, Rose stood framed against the setting sun. Her gloved hands rested on the rail, her posture perfect, her face turned toward the horizon. The wind caught the edge of her hat, lifting the feathers so they shimmered like fire. She looked not like a girl, but a vision, distant, unreachable, and unspeakably sad. His pencil paused. He watched as she removed her hat and held it for a moment. Then, with a sudden impulse, she threw it overboard. The hat tumbled down, spinning through the orange light, before vanishing into the sea. Jack smiled to himself. He didn't know who she was, not yet, but he knew that he had just seen someone who didn't belong to the world that claimed her. Someone who might be worth following, even to the ends of the earth. That night, the Titanic glided through the calm Atlantic under a sky of endless stars. Her decks glittered like a floating city. Music drifted from the grand staircase, laughter echoed through the corridors, and deep below, her engines whispered in rhythm to the turning of the earth. The passengers slept, or danced, or dreamed. But for two souls, one in a silk-lined suite and one in a steerage bunk, sleep did not come easily. For both, though they had never met, something had already begun to stir, something the ocean itself could not drown.
Chapter 5. The First Glance. Night had fallen, deep and absolute. The Atlantic stretched in every direction, a black mirror beneath a sky thick with stars. The air was still, almost reverent. The Titanic moved through it like a living creature, her bow slicing the calm water with effortless grace. Most of the ship slept. From the first-class decks came the distant hum of violins, the muffled echo of conversation. Somewhere below, laughter drifted up from steerage, bright and unguarded, the sound of the living among the soon-to-be ghosts. On the boat deck, Rose DeWitt Bukater walked alone. She moved quickly, breathless, the hem of her white evening gown whispering across the boards. Her gloves were gone, her hair loose, her eyes shining with something fierce and final. Behind her, the warm glow of the first-class lounge faded into the night. Ahead, only darkness, and the sound of the sea striking the hull. Her thoughts were a tangle of voices, her mother's cold warnings, Cal's possessive tenderness, the polite applause of a world that didn't care whether she could breathe. "You're a lady. You know what's expected of you. Smile, Rose, smile and endure." She reached the stern. The great bronze propellers churned the dark water far below, foaming and endless. The wind whipped her hair as she gripped the rail. The sea called to her, deep, cold, silent. For the first time in her life, it seemed to offer freedom. Down on the third-class deck, Jack Dawson leaned on the railing, smoking a borrowed cigarette. He was alone now. Fabrizio and Tommy had gone below, still laughing about the card game. Jack watched the stars ripple in the black water. The world up there, first class, money, manners, might as well have been another planet. And yet tonight he felt the invisible thread of it tugging at him. Then he heard something, a sound like a sob, faint and broken, carried on the wind. He turned. At first he saw only the white curve of the ship's rail, the endless fall of darkness beyond it. Then, higher up, near the stern rail, a figure moved. A woman, in a pale gown, climbing over the safety bar. Jack blinked, unsure if he was seeing right. Then the truth hit him like cold water. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. He dropped his cigarette and started running, up the steps, through the maze of decks, his boots echoing against the steel. When he reached the stern, the woman was already leaning forward, her hands white on the rail. "Don't do it!" he shouted. She froze, startled. The voice came from the shadows. Jack stepped into the light, breathless. "Stay back," she said sharply. "Don't come closer." "Okay," he said, raising his hands. "I'm not, but you're gonna have to give me your hand. You don't want to do this." She turned her face slightly toward him, her eyes filled with tears. "Stay where you are. I mean it. I'll let go." He took a cautious step closer. "No, you won't." Her voice cracked. "What do you mean, I won't? Don't presume to tell me what I will or will not do. You don't know me." "You would have done it already if you meant to," he said softly. "You're just looking for a way out." Her breath caught. The wind tugged at her gown. The sea roared below. "I've got a feeling," he said gently, "that you're the kind of girl who never learned to quit. Not all the way." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the water. Then, quietly, she whispered, "Leave me alone." "I can't," he said simply. "I'm involved now. You jump, I gotta jump too." She turned, confused. "Don't be absurd. You'll be killed." "I'm a good swimmer." He smiled faintly, though his heart was hammering. "Trust me, it'll be cold, but I'll manage." She stared at him, stunned by the absurdity, by the strange, reckless kindness in his eyes. "You're crazy." "Maybe, but I figure if you're gonna do it, now's the time, right? I mean, look at all this water." Her lips trembled. Then suddenly she slipped. Her foot caught on the hem of her dress, her body tilting forward over the rail. She screamed. Jack lunged. He caught her wrist with both hands and was almost pulled over himself, his boots scraping against the deck. "I got you," he gasped. "Hold on, I got you." She clung to him, half over the edge, her dress twisting in the wind. The freezing spray hit her face as she looked down, the black water wading below. "I can't." "Yes, you can. Don't let go." With a desperate effort, Jack hauled her back over the rail, both of them collapsing onto the deck in a heap. For a long second, they just lay there, gasping. Her heart pounded against his chest. Then she pulled away, trembling. Crewmen came running, shouting, "What's going on here?" and "Miss, are you all right?" Jack sat up quickly, hands raised. "She was trying to jump. I pulled her back." Rose, pale and shaken, looked from him to the crew to Cal, who appeared moments later, furious and immaculate. "What on earth?" he began, then saw her torn glove, her hair, the stranger kneeling beside her. "What were you thinking?" "It was an accident. I slipped," she stammered. Jack's eyes met hers, a silent exchange of understanding. She wasn't ready to tell the truth. Not yet. Cal turned on Jack, his face hard. "And what were you doing down here?" "Saving your fiancé's life," Jack said evenly. "Looked like she was going over." Cal's jaw tightened. "You expect me to believe that?" Rose whispered, "It's true. He saved me." A pause. Then Cal, with a forced smile, offered his hand. "Well, Mr. Dawson. Jack Dawson." "Mr. Dawson." Cal's voice dripped with false charm. "I'd be happy to see you properly thanked. Perhaps you'll join us for dinner tomorrow night to show our appreciation." Jack hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Sure, I'll count me in." As Cal led Rose away, his hand firm on her back, Jack remained on the deck, staring after her. The ship hummed softly beneath his feet, a living thing between two worlds. He didn't know her name yet, or her story, but he knew that something had changed. The ocean stretched black and endless around them, but somewhere in its cold reflection, a spark had caught fire.
Chapter 6. An Invitation to Dinner. Morning came soft and silver, the sea calm as glass. The Titanic glided westward beneath a sky so clear it seemed almost unreal. For a moment, the ocean looked endless and kind, hiding the secret that would later devour her whole. On the first-class deck, everything sparkled with newness, brass polished to a mirror's glow, white wicker chairs aligned in perfect order, passengers strolling in leisurely pairs. Among them walked Rose, her face pale but composed, her gloved hand resting lightly on her mother's arm. Ruth DeWitt Bukater spoke in a calm, clipped voice. "Do you realize the humiliation this could have caused us, Rose? The very idea of a lady climbing over the rail. If anyone had seen—" "Mother, please," Rose said softly. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were far away, staring over the water. Ruth's gaze hardened. "Cal has been generous enough to overlook the incident. You will do well to remember that. Your engagement is everything we have left, everything keeping us from disaster." She said the word as if it were a stain. Rose nodded faintly, her throat tight. "Yes, Mother." Kyle approached them, polished and smiling, as though the night before had never happened. "Good morning, darling. You look well rested." He kissed her gloved hand, his gesture too smooth, too practiced. She forced a smile. "Quite." He leaned close, voice low and possessive. "I've invited your hero to dinner this evening. It's only proper, after what he did. And besides," his smile tightened, "I'd like to meet the man who saved my fiancé's life." Rose's heart fluttered uneasily. Somewhere inside her, something whispered that this was no invitation at all. It was a test. That afternoon, below deck, Jack Dawson stood in front of a small mirror, trying to make his borrowed clothes behave. The borrowed suit was a size too small, the collar stiff and unfamiliar. He combed his hair with his fingers, then shrugged, half amused by his own reflection. Fabrizio whistled low. "You look like a prince, Jack. Maybe you find yourself a rich girl tonight, eh?" Jack grinned. "Yeah, maybe I will." When he stepped into the grand staircase foyer that evening, he paused. The sight before him stole even his easy confidence. The great crystal dome above glowed with amber light. The carved oak railings gleamed like honey. And the women, they glittered. Jewels, silks, laughter, and perfume filled the air like music. Jack felt suddenly like a stray cat in a cathedral. But he took a breath, straightened his shoulders, and began to climb. At the top of the staircase, Rose waited. She stood beside Cal and her mother, radiant in a red gown that shimmered with gold thread. Her hair was swept up, a single curl tracing the curve of her neck. When she saw Jack, a faint smile touched her lips, not polite, not social, but real. And for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, recognition, gratitude, and curiosity. "Mr. Dawson," said Cal smoothly, shaking his hand, "quite the hero of the hour." Jack nodded, glancing around. "I was just in the right place at the right time." Cal smiled without warmth. "And now you're in our world. Enjoy it while it lasts." Ruth extended her hand, her smile sharp as glass. "Mr. Dawson, you're quite the talk of the ship." Jack bowed slightly. "Only what's necessary, ma'am." They all laughed, except Rose, who couldn't stop watching him. The way he stood, so easy, so unguarded, was unlike any man she'd known. He didn't care who saw him or what they thought. It was intoxicating. Dinner in the first-class dining saloon was a spectacle of opulence. Chandeliers burned like constellations. Silverware gleamed in perfect rows. Waiters moved like dancers in black and white. Jack followed Cal's lead, careful but calm. He listened, smiled when he should, even cracked a joke or two that made the table laugh. Yet every so often he glanced at Rose, and she at him. Their eyes met across the table, and the rest of the world fell away. "So, Mr. Dawson," asked Colonel Gracie, his mustache twitching, "where exactly do you live?" "Right now? Well, let's see.
Out of America by way of Ireland, headed toward New York, next week, wherever I lay my hat." The table chuckled politely. Ruth's smile tightened. "You find that sort of existence appealing?" Jack shrugged. "I do. I mean, you learn to take life as it comes, to make each day count." "To make it count?" Rose tilted her head slightly. "That's right." Me met her eyes. Something flickered in her expression, a spark of longing. Cal noticed. His hand tightened on his wineglass until his knuckles went white. The dinner stretched on in laughter and small talk, but Rose's thoughts drifted far from the table. Jack's words lingered like a melody, make it count. Simple, reckless, free. When the ladies finally rose to leave, Rose stood too. As she passed behind Jack, she glanced down and whispered so quietly that only he could hear, "Thank you again." He looked up, and for an instant they were alone in a room full of people. Then she was gone, her perfume fading into the air. Later, on the A-deck promenade, the men smoked cigars and spoke of stocks and steel. Cal leaned on the rail, his voice low with pride and scorn. "Of course, the ship's worth more than most countries. White Star spared no expense, not that it matters to some." Bodine chuckled. "To the likes of Mr. Dawson, I'd imagine not." Jack said nothing. The stars shimmered above, their light caught in the glass of his borrowed wine. "Beautiful night," he said quietly. "Yes, and I intend to enjoy it, without the company of drifters." Jack smiled thinly, took the last sip of his champagne, and set the glass down. "Well, thanks for the fine evening. I gotta be getting back." He started toward the door, then turned back to Cal with a grin that was equal charm and defiance. "Oh, and, thanks for the suit. I'll take good care of it." Cal's eyes narrowed, but Jack was already gone. Outside, on the lower deck, the cold air bit at his face. Somewhere far above he could hear faint music, the waltz still drifting from the first-class lounge. But ahead, down a narrow stairway, came another sound entirely. Fills, laughter, the stomp of dancing feet. Curious, Jack descended. The steerage party was alive. Children clapped. Men danced on tables. Women spun with their hair flying loose. The air smelled of beer and wood smoke and joy. Jack grinned, snatched a mug from someone's hand, and dove in. Moments later, he looked up and froze. At the top of the stairs stood Rose, hesitating in her silk gown, her eyes wide as if she'd stumbled into another world. Behind her, Tommy Ryan laughed. "Well, now there's a sight! Come on, miss, don't just stand there." Jack reached up, hand extended. "Come on," he said softly. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she smiled. Not the polite social smile of a lady, but something brighter, freer. She took his hand. The music swelled, wild and alive. They danced. They laughed. The floor shook beneath their feet. The fiddles whirled, and the walls seemed to pulse with joy. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being watched. She wasn't pretending. She was alive. Jack spun her, her laughter ringing like glass. "You're good," he said. "Teach me to spit like a man and I'll be even better," she shot back. He laughed, surprised, delighted. "You got a deal." They danced until their hearts raced, until the air shimmered with heat and happiness. When she finally collapsed against him, breathless, she felt something she hadn't known in years. Freedom. Later, when the music had faded again, and the deck was quiet again, Rose stood alone under the stars. She looked down through the railings toward the steerage deck below, where Jack stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the sea. Their eyes met one last time that night. No words, no promises, just the slow, certain pull of two worlds beginning to collide.
Chapter 7. A Promise of Tomorrow. Dawn came softly to the North Atlantic. A pale gold light spilled across the calm sea, turning every ripple into glass. The great ship cut through it silently, her 4 funnels rising like towers above the mist. Seabirds followed in her wake, calling out to the morning as if to announce that life still was beautiful. In her stateroom, Rose DeWitt Bukater lay awake. Her mother's snores came faintly from the adjoining cabin. The sound of the ship's engines hummed through the walls like a heartbeat. Rose stared at the carved ceiling above her and replayed the night before. The dancing, the laughter, Jack's warm hand around hers, the wild joy of not being watched. For hours afterward, she felt the rhythm of the fiddle in her blood, as if she had left something of herself down there, in that crowded room full of strangers. She turned toward the porthole. Outside, the horizon glowed. Somewhere down below, he would be waking too, maybe sketching, maybe still asleep, his hair falling into his eyes. She smiled, almost shyly. Then her mother's voice shattered the quiet. "Rose, up, dear. We breakfast with Mr. Ismay and the Astors at 9. Do hurry." The smile faded. Rose closed her eyes. The spell was broken. On the first-class deck later that morning, Ruth spoke to Cal with tight-lipped elegance. "She has always been willful, but this fascination with that boy must stop." Cal's expression was smooth, but his eyes were cold. "It will," he said simply. "I'll see to it." He found Rose that afternoon in the lounge, seated beside Molly Brown, laughing over tea. The sound startled him. Laughter that wasn't calculated, but genuine. It made him uneasy. "Good afternoon, darling," he said, voice like polished marble. "Might I have a word?" Rose excused herself politely and followed him to the corridor. Cal turned, his smile gone. "I had hoped that you might have the grace to behave with discretion. Dancing in steerage, really." Her chin lifted. "It was just a party. They were kind to me." "Kind?" He stepped closer. "You belong here, Rose, with people of quality. That boy is beneath you, a drifter, a thief of opportunity." Her eyes flared. "He saved my life." Cal's voice softened dangerously. "And I've saved yours a dozen times over. Don't forget who you owe." He left her standing there, her heart pounding, her throat tight with anger she couldn't yet name. Later that day, Rose wandered alone along the promenade. The sea was calm again, the air sharp and bright. Passengers strolled in conversation. The brass band played softly, and everything looked exactly as it should, perfect, civilized, lifeless. Until she saw him. Jack leaned on the railing, sketchbook open, pencil moving lightly across the page. He didn't notice her at first. The sunlight fell on his hair, making it gold. There was something so unguarded in the way he stood, as if he had nothing to prove, nothing to hide. She approached quietly, drawing again. He looked up, startled, then smiled, trying to capture the moment before it gets away. She glanced at the page, a mother holding her child near the stern, the wind tugging at both their hair. The lines were simple, but alive. "You have a gift," she said softly. He shrugged. "I just see people. That's all." They stood together, watching the horizon. The silence between them was easy, like breathing. Then he said, "You wouldn't have jumped, would you?" She hesitated. "No," she admitted, "but I was desperate enough to think about it." Jack nodded slowly. "I've been there. Not on a fancy ship, but close enough. Sometimes life's like a game of poker. You can't choose the hand you're dealt. You can only play it." She smiled faintly. "And you play yours well, Mr. Dawson." He grinned. "You have to, when you got nothing." A gull screamed overhead, slicing through the silence. Rose looked out across the endless blue. It's so vast, so endless. My whole life, everything I've known, feels so small compared to this. Jack studied her face. That's the thing about freedom, he said. Once you taste it, you can't go back. Their eyes met, a quiet spark between two souls standing on the edge of the world. Then, impulsively, she said, "Show me what it's like, what you do, how you live." He blinked. "You mean now?" She laughed, sudden and light. "Now." They wandered through the ship together, down through the steel corridors and narrow stairways, past the galleys and boiler rooms where the air shimmered with heat. Crewmen nodded to Jack, curious at the sight of a first-class lady at his side. Rose didn't care. Every step felt like shedding a layer of skin she no longer needed. He showed her the engine room, the roaring furnaces, the coal dust glittering in the light. He told her about Paris, about sketching on the banks of the Seine, about sleeping under bridges with the artists and dreamers. She listened like someone starving. At last they stood on the bow, the sea wind fierce against their faces. "Close your eyes," Jack said. She did. He stepped behind her, hands gently on her waist. "Now stretch your arms out and hold them there." She raised her arms, trembling slightly, her palms open to the wind. "Do you trust me?" "Yes," she breathed. "Then open your eyes." She did, and she gasped. The ship's bow sliced through the sea, and below them the ocean unfurled like an endless carpet of silver and blue. The wind rushed through her hair, cold and pure. For a moment she felt weightless, as if she were flying. "I'm flying!" she cried. Jack laughed softly beside her. "What did I tell you?" She turned her head slightly, and their eyes met. The world narrowed to that single heartbeat. Then, without words, he kissed her. It was gentle, uncertain, and completely inevitable. The sea wind wrapped around them, and far below, the ship carried on, vast, unstoppable, unaware that something greater than itself had just begun.
Chapter 8. The Portrait. Evening descended slowly over the Atlantic. The sky, streaked with violet and gold, darkened to a deep indigo as the first stars appeared. Lamps flickered to life along the decks, and the Titanic glowed softly against the dark water, a palace adrift between heaven and earth. In her stateroom, Rose DeWitt Bukater sat before her vanity, staring at her reflection. Her heart still raced from the memory of the bow, the wind, the kiss, the impossible freedom of it. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel his hands on her waist, steady and sure, the salt air against her skin, the vastness beneath her feet. Behind her, Kaladin Hockley moved about the suite, pacing like a man who had lost something he could not name. His voice was calm, but his movements sharp. "I've been everywhere looking for you. Where were you all afternoon?" "Out," Rose said quietly, "getting some air." Cal stopped. His reflection appeared behind her in the mirror, his dark eyes studying her face. "I see." His tone was smooth, measured, but cold. "You have a curious definition of propriety, my dear." Rose's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He placed a small blue box on the vanity beside her. "Perhaps this will remind you of your obligations." Inside, nestled in velvet, lay the heart of the ocean, the great blue diamond glowing like frozen fire. Its light bathed her face in blue. He took it out, unclasped it, and fastened it around her neck. "It belonged to Louis XVI," he said. "It's a symbol, Rose, of my faith in you and my trust." the weight of the jewel pressed against her collarbone, cold and heavy. She looked at herself in the mirror, at the glittering thing on her throat, and felt like she was being chained. Hours later, she found herself walking the corridors of first class in silence. The ship was quiet now, the great hallways empty but for the low hum of the engines beneath her feet. Her gloved hand brushed against the paneled walls as she walked, each step carrying her further from the world she had always known. When she reached his cabin, she didn't knock. Jack looked up from his sketchbook, surprised. "Rose." "I want you to draw me," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Like one of your French girls," she said softly. "Wearing this." She touched the diamond at her throat. "And nothing else." For a moment neither spoke. The hum of the ship filled the silence. Then Jack stood, wordless, and moved to prepare his pencils and paper. His hands shook slightly, not from desire, but from reverence, as if what he was about to do required a kind of faith. Rose stepped behind the screen. Her hands trembled as she undid the fastenings of her gown, one by one, until the silk slid from her shoulders and pooled at her feet. The diamond caught the lamplight, casting blue fire across her skin. She took a slow breath and walked out, barefoot, pale against the dark velvet of the couch. Jack looked up, and for the first time in his life forgot how to speak. He sat down, his voice quiet. "Over there, by the divan," head turned a little. "Yes, like that." She reclined, her posture elegant, but her eyes steady on his. There was no shame in her, only trust. He began to draw. The pencil moved lightly across the paper, sketching the curve of her neck, the slope of her shoulder, the softness of her hand. His breath matched the rhythm of the ship, slow, steady, inevitable. The diamond gleamed at her throat like a heartbeat. Neither spoke. Only the whisper of graphite on paper filled the room. When he finished, he looked up. The lamplight glowed between them, soft, fragile, eternal. "Hold still," he murmured. "I want to remember this." She smiled faintly. "You already have." Later, she watched as he placed the drawing into a leather folder, careful and deliberate. On the corner he wrote the date, April 14th, 1912. Her eyes lingered on the line of his signature, J.D. Then she rose and dressed again, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the quiet certainty that she had just stepped beyond the boundaries of her own life. "Now what?" she whispered. He smiled. "Now we put it somewhere safe." They moved quickly, silent as shadows through the ship's gilded corridors. Rose led the way, her bare feet whispering over the carpet, her laughter muffled behind her hand. They reached the grand staircase, empty, echoing. Jack followed her down into the lower decks, his sketch portfolio tucked under his arm. They reached the small service elevator, the kind used for trunks and luggage. She pulled him in after her, breathless. "Where to, miss?" Jack asked with a grin. "To the stars," she whispered. The doors clanged shut, and the lift jolted downward, into darkness. In the cargo hold, the air was cold and still. Crates and automobiles gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Rose ran between them, laughing softly, her voice echoing off the steel walls. Jack followed, unable to take his eyes off her. She stopped beside a gleaming Renault, Cal's car. She looked at him, her eyes alight. "Put your hands on me, Jack." He hesitated for only a moment. Then he did. Outside, the ship's engines thundered softly, steady as a heartbeat. Inside, time stopped. Their hands found each other. Their breath mingled with the fog on the windows, and the glass turned to silver with every exhale. When at last the world returned, they lay tangled in the quiet, the hum of the great ship surrounding them like a lullaby. Rose pressed her hand to the fogged window, leaving the mark of her palm, a single human truth against the vast, indifferent sea. Above them, the Titanic sailed on beneath a sky thick with stars, and somewhere in the frozen dark ahead, an iceberg waited.
Chapter 9. Collision Course. The night was clear and bitterly cold. The stars hung sharp and bright above the Atlantic, reflected perfectly in the black glass of the water. The Titanic sailed through it like a great silver city, its lights glowing against the endless dark. The sea was calm, too calm, and the air so still that the smoke from her funnels rose straight up to the heavens. In the depths of the ship, two figures moved through the narrow steel corridors, hand in hand, Jack and Rose. They were breathless, half laughing, half terrified, their hearts still pounding from what had just passed between them. The air in the cargo hold had been thick with heat and promise. Now the chill of the Atlantic cut through their clothes like a reminder that the world had returned. Rose gripped Jack's hand tightly. "They'll be looking for us," she whispered. Jack grinned. "Let 'em. They'll never think to look down here." She laughed, the sound free and wild, echoing down the corridor. But the moment shattered when a voice barked behind them. "There they are!" It was Lovejoy, Cal's valet, flanked by two crewmen with lanterns. His expression was hard, triumphant. "End of the line, Dawson." Jack and Rose ran. Their footsteps rang on the metal stairs, their laughter turning to panting gasps. They darted through half-lit passages, down into the boiler rooms, past the roaring furnaces and sweating stokers. Steam hissed, pipes clanged, and the air shimmered with heat. Lovejoy followed, relentless. At last Jack pulled Rose through a heavy door and into the engine room. The great pistons thundered above them, rising and falling like the heartbeat of a giant. They pressed themselves against the wall, breathless, the heat and sound swallowing everything else. Rose looked at him, her eyes bright with fear and exhilaration. "We're trapped." Jack smiled. "Then we'll make our own way out." They found a ladder leading up and climbed until they reached a small hatch that opened onto the orlop deck. From there they slipped quietly back into the shadows of the ship's lower halls, unnoticed. For the first time that night, Rose realized how enormous the ship truly was. A labyrinth of rooms, corridors, and lives. "Where are we?" she whispered. Jack shrugged. "Halfway to the moon." In the first-class suite, Caledon Hockley stood like a statue. The stateroom was immaculate, except for one thing. On the bed, surrounded by the soft glow of lamplight, lay a leather folder. He picked it up, frowning. Inside was a drawing, delicate, intimate, unmistakable. A woman reclining on a divan, wearing nothing but the heart of the ocean. Rose. His hand trembled. The blue diamond glimmered faintly against her drawn skin. He turned the page and saw the note in Jack's handwriting. To Rose, April 14th, 1912. Cal's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his silence was more dangerous than any shout. He placed the drawing back in its folder, his mind cold and sharp. Moments later, Lovejoy appeared, disheveled, his coat streaked with coal dust. "I found them, sir, down near the boilers. Lost them in the engine room. Cal's eyes narrowed. You lost them? Yes, sir, but I know where they're headed. She's with him. Cal turned away, looking out the porthole at the calm, endless sea. Then it's time we teach Mr. Dawson his place. Above deck, unaware of what was brewing below, the ship pressed on at full speed. The temperature had dropped sharply. Frost glimmered on the rails, and the breath of every crewman rose white in the air. In the crow nest, lookout Frederick Fleet stamped his feet to keep warm. The sea was like polished steel. No wind, no waves, no moon. "You can smell the ice," his mate murmured. Fleet nodded. "If it's out there, we'll see it." But they wouldn't, not until it was too late. Jack and Rose, meanwhile, slipped quietly back into the night air. The stars spread above them in their silent thousands, and the hum of the ship felt almost peaceful again. Rose leaned against the railing, catching her breath. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered. Jack stepped beside her. "We're kind of are." She looked at him, her hair loose, her face lit by the faint starlight. "When this ship docks," she said softly, "I'm getting off with you." He blinked. "What?" "I mean it, Jack. I can't go back. Not to him. Not to that life." He reached for her hand. "Are you sure? Because once you step off with me, there's no going back." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "I know." He kissed her then, not the stolen kiss of the bow, but something deeper, more certain. The ship glided on beneath their feet, unaware that history was turning beneath its own stars. Far above them, in the crow nest, Fleet suddenly froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Ahead of the ship, faint and white, something loomed out of the dark. Not light, but the absence of it. A shape too large, too still. "Iceberg, right ahead!" The bell clanged 3 times. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch snapped his head up. "Hard to starboard." The helmsman spun the wheel. The engines reversed, gears shrieking in protest. Far below, the stokers cursed as the great turbines groaned to a halt. For a moment, it seemed the Titanic might clear the danger. Her bow beginning to turn, the iceberg sliding past on the starboard side. Then came the sound, a low, tearing groan that vibrated through the entire ship. Steel screamed, rivets popped like gunfire, ice shattered across the deck. The ship shuddered. Jack and Rose grabbed the rail as a rumble rolled beneath their feet. "What was that?" Rose gasped. Jack frowned, listening to the strange stillness that followed. "Something's wrong." In the depths of the ship, water was already flooding the forward compartments. Crewmen ran, shouting orders, boots splashing through the freezing dark. The sea poured in like liquid glass, unstoppable, merciless. The Titanic had been wounded, not fatally, not yet, but enough to bleed. On the bridge, Captain Smith appeared in his nightcoat, his face pale. "What have we hit?" Murdoch's voice was hollow. "An iceberg, sir. I tried to port around it, but she was too close." "How bad?" 5 compartments, maybe more. She's taking water fast." Smith turned to the shipbuilder, Thomas Andrews, who had appeared silently, summoned by the sound of doom. Andrews's face was already drawn with realization. "She can stay afloat with 4 flooded, not 5, he said quietly. The captain stared at him. "How long?" "An hour and a half. 2 at the most." The words hung in the frozen air like a death sentence. Far below, Jack and Rose ran through the echoing corridors as the ship began to list, almost imperceptibly. Crewmen hurried past them, voices raised, boots pounding. Somewhere a door slammed. Somewhere else a child began to cry. Jack stopped and looked back toward the bow, where the faint smell of ice and salt hung in the air. "Hold on," he said quietly. "Something's happening." She turned to him, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" He took her hand. "We stay together." Above them, the Titanic sailed on, wounded but proud, her lights still burning against the indifferent stars. No one yet believed the truth that the unsinkable ship had already begun to die.
Chapter 10. The Fall of the Dream. At first, the ship seemed perfectly calm. The stars still glittered, the band still played, and most of the passengers, snug in their cabins, barely stirred. The great Titanic glided silently through the darkness. Her engines stopped, her lights bright and steady. Only those who worked in her veins, the stokers, the engineers, the officers on the bridge, knew that death had already entered the ship. In the freezing dark below, seawater surged through torn steel. It poured across the floors, gushing through vents and bulkheads, climbing one compartment after another with terrible patience. Crewmen shouted to close the watertight doors. The great iron barriers groaned as they descended, but the water was faster, unstoppable, ancient, alive. On the bridge, Captain Smith stood pale and silent as Thomas Andrews traced the line of damage on a blueprint spread across the chart table. From the bow to E-deck, 5 compartments flooded, maybe 6. Smith's voice was barely a whisper. "Can she stay afloat?" Andrews shook his head. "No. The first 4 compartments could flood and she'd still float, but the 5th tips her just enough for the water to spill over. It will go one after another, like dominoes. She's doomed." A long silence. Outside the bridge windows, the iceberg drifted away, ghostly, indifferent, gleaming faintly in the starlight. "How much time?" Smith asked. "An hour and a half, 2 at best." Smith straightened, his face hardening with resolve. "Then we must get them off. Wake everyone. Muster the boats." Murdoch hesitated. "Should we sound the alarm, sir?" Smith shook his head. "Not yet. We don't want panic. Start with the first-class stewards, quietly." But nothing about the next hours would be quiet. In the corridors of first class, stewards knocked politely at doors. "Sorry to disturb you, ladies and gentlemen. There's been a slight collision. Captain requests you put on your life belts and come on deck." At first, the passengers were irritated rather than frightened. They grumbled, wrapped themselves in fur coats, complained about the cold. One man asked if this was part of the evening's entertainment. The ship felt so steady, so magnificent. How could anything truly be wrong? In the warmth of their suite, Caledon Hockley poured himself a brandy, perfectly calm. Rose sat nearby, pale but alert, her eyes fixed on the floor. "What's happening?" she asked. "Nothing of consequence," Cal said smoothly. "A little scrape, that's all. The ship's unsinkable." But Rose wasn't listening to him. Somewhere deep in the ship, she could feel it, a faint vibration beneath the floor, a new and uneven rhythm. The heartbeat of the Titanic had changed. Without a word, she turned and walked out. Down in the steerage decks, the truth had already arrived. Water sloshed through the corridors, cold and rising fast. Mothers clutched crying children. Men pounded on locked gates, shouting in dozens of languages. "Open this! Let us through!" But the guards only shook their heads, orders in hand. "Stay calm! Stay where you are!" Jack and Fabrizio pushed through the chaos, searching for a way up. The gangways were already closing, doors locked. Somewhere he heard the scream of twisting metal, the sound of something enormous breaking. Then he saw her. Rose stood at the end of the corridor, the lamplight behind her, her white nightdress pale against the darkness. "Jack!" she called. He ran to her, relief flooding his face. "You came back!" She said, "I said I would." They embraced briefly, then he pulled away. "We've got to move. The water's coming fast." They ran together through the labyrinth of corridors, past crowds of frightened passengers. Jack led her toward the stairs, only to find the gate locked tight. He grabbed the bars and shook them furiously. "Hey, we need to get through!" The steward on the other side hesitated, fear in his eyes. "Orders are orders, sir. Passengers must wait." "For what?" Jack shouted. "To drown?" The man didn't answer. Jack turned, his eyes scanning. Then he grabbed a nearby bench, swung it hard against the gate. The lock snapped. Rose gasped, but he only said, "Come on." They climbed upward through the narrow passageways, the sound of chaos rising behind them, boots splashing, doors slamming, children crying. The ship's list was growing now, the deck tilted subtly beneath their feet. On the boat deck, the cold bit like knives. Ice glittered on the railings. The sea was perfectly still and the horizon curved black and cruel around the ship. Officer Lightoller shouted orders. "Women and children first! Lowered away number 6. The first lifeboats hung over the side, swinging uneasily in the frigid air. Many of them were half empty. Passengers hesitated, unwilling to believe they were truly in danger. Some laughed nervously. Others protested at being separated from their husbands. "Why can't we all go together?" a woman cried. "There's no danger," another man insisted. "We're safer here than in those little boats." Rose and Jack reached the deck, breathless. Around them, confusion reigned. The band still played softly. Couples huddled in blankets. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Above it all, the ship's great funnels groaned as the bow dipped imperceptibly lower into the sea. Jack turned to Rose. "You have to get to a boat." "No," she said, "not without you." "Rose, you have to go," he said firmly. "I'll find another way off, I promise." She shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. "You jump, I jump, remember?" Before he could answer, Cal appeared, flanked by Lovejoy and an officer. His face was composed, his voice calm. "There you are. You're going with the others. Mr. Dawson's assistance is no longer required." Jack stepped in front of Rose. "She's not going anywhere with you." Cal's eyes flicked to the officer. "This man has stolen something from me. Arrest him." The officer grabbed Jack's arm. "Is this true?" Cal reached into his coat and held up the diamond case. "Found it in his pocket." Rose's eyes widened. "That's not true. He didn't—" But Jack was already being pulled away. "It's all right," he said quietly to her. "You have to stay safe." "Jack!" she cried as he was dragged below. Cal took her arm. "You see, my dear, you truly are a poor judge of character." Rose ripped her arm free, glaring at him. "I'd rather be his whore than your wife." Cal's expression hardened. For the first time, the mask cracked. Below decks, Jack was handcuffed to a pipe in the Masters-at-Arms office, the water rising slowly around his boots. He struggled, shouted, but no one came. The corridor outside was empty. The sound of rushing water grew louder by the minute. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling at the cuffs until his wrists bled. "Rose!" On deck, the first lifeboats began to lower. The crowd grew restless. People started to really realize that the ship was dying. Ruth DeWitt Bukater stood in line with other ladies, her face pale, her hands trembling inside her gloves. "Will the boats be back for the rest of us?" she asked. The officer didn't answer. Somewhere in the chaos, Rose slipped away from Cal. Her hair whipped in the freezing wind as she ran through the ship, down one stairwell after another, searching for Jack. The decks tilted beneath her, water pooling along the floors. She could hear it now, the roaring of the sea through the ship's hollow corridors. Somewhere above, people screamed. Somewhere below, the lights flickered. And through it all, the band played on, a waltz drifting through the icy air, defiant and beautiful. By midnight, the bow was nearly under. The Titanic, the ship of dreams, had become a nightmare, tilted, broken, and sinking fast. But Jack and Rose were still running, still fighting, and still holding on to each other against the impossible, because love, once found, will always try to live, even as the world goes dark around it.
Chapter 11. The Last Night on Earth. The ship was dying. The bow was already swallowed by the sea, and the stern rose higher with every passing minute, groaning like a wounded beast. The sound was unbearable, a chorus of breaking glass, twisting metal, and human voices calling into the dark. Above it all, the band played on, not for courage now, but for mercy. Jack and Rose burst through a doorway onto the starboard deck. The wind howled, carrying the cold sting of the Atlantic. The lights flickered, casting brief flashes across faces that no longer looked human, pale, terrified, desperate. "Come on!" Jack shouted over the roar of the wind. He pulled her toward the lifeboats. But most of them were gone. Only a few boats remained, crowded, clinging to the rails as officers shouted, "Women and children first!" Rose looked around wildly. People were pushing, crying, praying. Mothers pressed babies into strangers' arms. Husbands kissed their wives' hands and stepped back into the shadows. The deck tilted further. Luggage slid, chairs toppled, and the air filled with the sharp smell of smoke and cold iron. "Rose!" She turned. Cal stood at the edge of the crowd, his face drawn and wild, his hair plastered with sea spray. "He's lost his mind!" Rose gasped. "No," Jack said. "He's lost control." They ran through the chaos, down the tilted deck, past overturned benches and screaming passengers. Behind them, Cal's footsteps pounded closer. Then, suddenly, he stopped. The sound of water was everywhere now, gushing, thundering, devouring. The sea had reached the grand staircase, pouring through the glass dome like a waterfall of stars. Cal turned in disbelief as the cold rose around his knees. He fired one last shot into the dark, then turned and fled. Jack and Rose stumbled into the first-class foyer. Water surged through the corridors, waist-deep and rising fast. The chandeliers swayed, their reflections shimmering in the black flood. They reached the grand staircase, the ship's proud heart, now cracked and dying. Above them, the great clock still ticked, marking the last moments of the age of elegance. "Hold on to me," Jack said. They waded forward as the water rushed down the steps, sweeping rugs and furniture past them. A piano drifted sideways in the current, its keys clattering a discordant tune. The world tilted further, 15 degrees, 20. The ship was bowing to its fate. At the top of the stairs, Captain Smith stood motionless, the sea already at his feet. He had sent every distress call he could. Now he simply stared through the windows at the horizon, black water, black sky, and whispered something only the ocean could hear. Then the bridge windows burst inward, and he was gone. On deck, chaos had turned to madness. Men in tuxedos clawed for space in the boats. Officers threatened to shoot anyone who pushed ahead.
One fired into the air, the sound echoing like thunder. A woman screamed, clutching her child. Another fainted. Someone prayed aloud, "God, forgive us!" Rose looked around, dizzy with horror. "Jack, there's no more boats!" He took her face in his hands. "Then we have to make our own luck." Below them, the ship's bow plunged deeper, dragging the stern high into the air. The deck tilted at a terrifying angle. People slid down the slope, screaming, tumbling into the blackness below. The funnels groaned, tearing from their mounts. "Hang on!" Jack shouted, pulling Rose toward the starboard rail. "When she goes under, the suction will pull us down. We've got to be ready." They climbed, slipping, gasping, the deck trembling beneath them. Around them, hundreds clung to the rails, praying, crying, frozen with fear. The ship creaked like an old cathedral collapsing in on itself. Rose looked up. The stars were still there, calm, eternal, cruel. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "It is," Jack said, pulling her close. "But listen to me. You'll make it. You're going to live a long, full life. You'll die an old lady, warm in your bed. Not here, not tonight." She shook her head, tears streaming. "I can't, not without you." He smiled, brushing the hair from her face. "You'll do it for both of us." The stern lifted higher. People screamed as they lost their grip and fell into the darkness below. The great ship's spine groaned, a low, endless crack. Then, with a sound like thunder, the Titanic broke in two. The bow plunged, dragging the stern down with it. Rose and Jack clung to the railing as the deck rose nearly vertical. The sky and sea traded places. "Hold your breath," Jack said. "When she goes under, kick for the surface. Don't let go." "I won't," she said. He kissed her once, fierce, desperate, eternal, as the ship slipped beneath them. Then the world went under. The freezing Atlantic swallowed everything. Sound vanished, light vanished, only cold remained, a cold so deep that it felt like darkness made solid. Rose's lungs burned, her dress dragged her down. Then suddenly Jack's hand found hers, pulling her upward, up through the swirling black until they burst into the air, gasping. The ocean was a graveyard of lights. Bodies floated among overturned lifeboats. The Titanic's stern stood upright for a moment, black against the stars, then groaned and disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only silence. Rose clung to a piece of wooden paneling half submerged in the water. Jack helped her onto it, but when he tried to climb up too, the board tilted dangerously. "It won't hold us both," he said. "Stay there. Keep your head above water." She reached for him. "No, get up here." He shook his head, smiling faintly. "You're going to get out of this, Rose. Promise me you'll survive, that you'll never give up, no matter what happens, no matter how hopeless." "I promise," she whispered, sobbing. "I won't let go." He nodded. "That's good." He stayed beside her, his hand gripping hers, his eyes fixed on her face. They spoke little after that. The cold made speech painful. But she could still feel the warmth of him, even as the world froze. Minutes passed, hours maybe. The cries of the others faded into silence. One by one, the stars blurred above her, tears freezing on her lashes. "Jack," she whispered once. "Jack." He didn't answer. She touched his face, her fingers numb. His eyes were closed, his expression peaceful, as if he were only sleeping. Her breath caught. The promise echoed in her mind. "You'll survive. You'll never give up." "Goodbye, my love," she whispered. She pressed her lips to his hand, then gently let him drift away into the dark water. A faint sound reached her, the distant call of voices, the splash of oars. A lifeboat was returning. "Is there anyone alive out there?" Rose turned her head toward the sound. Her lips were blue, her body stiff. She tried to call out, but no voice came. Then she saw the whistle hanging from the jacket of a dead officer nearby. With the last of her strength, she reached for it, pressed it to her lips, and blew. The shrill note pierced the silence, once, twice, again. The lifeboat turned toward her. By dawn, the sea was still again. Icebergs drifted quietly under the pale morning light. Smoke and bodies floated across the endless horizon, and in the silence, a single whistle echoed, thin, human, defiant.
Chapter 12. The Heart Will Go On. Dawn broke pale and silent over the North Atlantic. The sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. The wind was soft now, almost tender, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and smoke. Icebergs drifted like ghosts through the mist, their white peaks glowing in the early light. Through the gray haze the Carpathia appeared, a small, dark ship cutting gently across the frozen water. Her decks were lined with lifeboats. Inside them sat the survivors, shivering, silent, faces turned to the sea that had taken everything. Among them was Rose de Witbucator. She sat wrapped in a woolen blanket, her hair stiff with salt, her skin colorless. She looked not at the rescuers nor at the sky, but at the horizon, that empty, endless place where the ship had gone down. Her hands trembled around the edge of the blanket. In one palm she still clutched a small blue jewel, the heart of the ocean, its light faint beneath the gray sky. A steward bent toward her gently. "Miss, your name?" For a long moment she didn't answer. The question seemed to come from very far away. Then, softly, she said, "Dawson. Rose Dawson." He nodded, writing it down. "Thank you, Miss Dawson." She watched him walk away, her lips barely moving as she whispered the name again, not as an alias, but as a vow. Rose Dawson, the girl who had lived. They reached New York under a curtain of rain. The Statue of Liberty loomed through the fog, her torch dim in the gray morning. Crowds waited on the pier, families calling out names, reporters shouting questions, flashes of cameras like lightning. Cal was there. So was Ruth. But Rose did not go to them. She stepped quietly off the gangway, her blanket pulled tight, her hair damp against her cheeks. No one called her name. No one noticed as she disappeared into the crowd, a ghost among the living, carrying a new name, a new life, and a promise that belonged only to her. Years passed. Decades rolled over one another like waves. The world changed. Cars replaced carriages. Cities rose. Wars came and went. But somewhere, always, there was a woman who remembered the feel of the sea wind on her face and the sound of a boy's laughter beneath the stars. Rose lived the life he had told her to live. She danced, she rode horses on the beach, she learned to fly, she married, raised children, built a home filled with laughter and sunlight. And through it all, she carried him with her, in her heart, in her art, in her dreams. Sometimes, on quiet nights, she would open a drawer and touch the old folded sketch, the girl she once was, drawn by the boy who had taught her to live. She would trace the lines with trembling fingers, and for a moment the years would fall away.
84 years later, aboard the research ship Keldysh, Brock Lovett and his crew sat in silence. The old woman had told her story. The cameras were off, the lights dimmed. No one spoke. Outside, the North Atlantic rolled dark and endless. The same waters that had swallowed the ship, the same that now carried the quiet echo of her words. In her cabin, Rose Calvert sat by the window, looking out at the moonlit sea. Her wrinkled hands rested on the blanket in her lap. Beside her was the small leather box, unopened, unspoken of. Inside it, the diamond still shone, untouched by time. She looked at it for a long while. The jewel was beautiful, cold, perfect, eternal. But it no longer belonged to the world. She smiled faintly. He exists now only in my heart, but that's enough. Then, quietly, she rose. She moved to the railing, the night air cool against her skin. The crew slept. The sea murmured below. She held the jewel one last time, feeling its weight, the weight of love, of memory, of survival. And then she let it go. The heart of the ocean arced through the air, catching the moonlight, flashing once, and vanished into the black water below. Later, in her bed, she closed her eyes. The room was filled with photographs, her children, her grandchildren, her horses, her laughter, a life well lived, just as he had told her to have. Her breathing slowed. The hum of the ship became the hum of the sea, and in the silence that followed, something shifted, not an ending, but a return. In her dream she was young again. The ocean was calm. The grand staircase gleamed with golden light. People moved through it slowly, their faces peaceful, radiant, untouched by time. The band played softly, the same waltz that had echoed through the night so long ago. At the top of the stairs, he waited. Jack. He turned as she approached, his blue eyes alive with light, his hand reaching out. She took it, smiling through tears that no longer existed. Around them, the ship was whole again, perfect, eternal, a dream reborn. The crowd began to applaud as he led her up the steps into the light. They kissed, and the ship of dreams sailed on forever.